I
Matter,
mean, I'm Gen Z, so I'll never understand what it's like to buy a house, but
yeah,
it's a lot of
but
documents.
exactly.
Hello, team, and welcome to Bureaucracy. I'm your host, Emily Gross, and I'm very excited today because I have Vali Nasr with me, who is a professor at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and was a senior advisor to the U.S. Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan at the State Department. And we're going to be talking all about what's going on with the latest escalation between Iran and Israel. So, Vali, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be with you.
Very excited to have you. So before we begin, what are we drinking?
Actually, right, just drinking water, hydrate.
Good for you.
Thank-
I am drinking iced coffee, my second one of the day, which means that I'm gonna be able to, feel my heartbeat in every part of my body soon. So,
Excellent.
starting off strong. So the question I always love to ask my guests is, why should we trust what you have to say?
Well, I've been working on this topic for a very long time, and I approach it as a historian. So I look at examples of the past and I look at evidence, and then I try to understand what's happening and then, project in terms of what we might expect going forward.
Well, can appreciate that. And also you just wrote a book too.
Well, that actually goes to why you might trust me. The book is called Iran's Grand Strategy, a political history, in which I actually looked at a lot of documents and history of U.S.-Iran relations on why and how Iran sees the world around it. Why does it behave this way? Why does it feel threatened, or where does it have ambition? And so this moment basically speaks to that as well.
Awesome. Well, all right. So very happy to have you. Could not think of anyone better to discuss this with. So there's been a lot going on, and especially in the past couple of days, Israel launched this offensive against Iran, targeting a lot of their nuclear facilities and recently their energy facilities, and a lot of military leaders as well. Obviously, Iran responded. Now it's this lovely little volley of back and forth of how many things can we destroy. So, and also while this was happening, Iran and the US were having I think the sixth iteration of nuclear talks to try to come up with some type of agreement. Could you elaborate on those talks and the recent escalation and why this may have happened now?
Well, Iran and Israel have been at it for a long time. And increasingly, they basically became the two gorillas in the Middle East cage, if you would. Middle East largely was becoming a scene of great power rivalry between them. Yes, I know Israel has a particular angst about Iran as being anti-Israel, wanting to destroy the Jewish state, being supportive of radical groups. But beyond all of this is that Iran sees itself as a claimant to regional hegemony, as being the Persian, Iranian, an empire in the region, and Israel does not necessarily accept any kind of a power in the region, particularly this anti-Israeli and supports groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, etc. And they had been going at it for a long time. And the fact that Iran was developing a nuclear program since 2003 made this rivalry more intense and made Israel's angst about Iran more intense. Then October 7th happens. And October 7th was interpreted by Israel as a massive power play by Iran and the proxies that it was building. Yes, Hamas had its own reasons for attacking Israel. It wants to promote Palestinian cause. It wants liberation of Palestinian lands, etc. But Iran was the one that was enabling Hamas with intelligence, training, money, etc. And as soon as Hamas attacked Israel, then in that moment where Israel was shell-shocked, angry with the scale and brevity of the attack, Hezbollah and then the Houthis and other Iranian networks joined the fight. So it looked like Israel was besieged, if you would, by Iran. And then in the second year of the Gaza war, the tables were turned in effect. In other words, Israel not only decimated Hamas in Gaza, but then decimated Hezbollah and its leadership through that famous pager attack, and then the killing of Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah. And then the tables were essentially turned on Iran. So why at this moment is because I think Israel sees an opportunity to basically take the wins that it won in the Levant, in Syria, Lebanon, Palestinian territories, in Gaza, to now take it to Iran and essentially finish off the axis of resistance altogether. Because after all, to Israel, these forces on its borders are merely tentacles of an Iranian regional operation. So it's a opportunity for Israel to fix the Iran problem altogether, not just its nuclear program. But and why now? Because Iran is first of all weakened by what happened in Gaza. Israel is particularly strong because of what it did with Hezbollah and the way the Gaza war has turned, but also because Israel sees a nuclear deal between US and Iran as giving Iran breathing room. Israel is not interested in any kind of a deal that actually would let Iran survive in its current form. With a nuclear program able to rebuild, keeping its regional status, Israel really wants a knockout against Iran. Not just so. So that's why Israelis were not enthusiastic about the nuclear deal. And as much as Trump would say, well, there's a diplomatic solution here, they said, no, we don't want a diplomatic solution in which they give a little, they get a little. We want you to commit to finishing it off. And that's what they're trying to do. They're attacked Iran's nuclear program as ferociously as they could, but they still need the United States to come in and use its massive bunker buster bombs and B 2 bombers to really finish off Iran's nuclear program. So this is really, if you would, a way in which for Israel to uh, uh, finish off a rival, an adversary that is positioning as its counterpart in a Middle East Cold War for the past 3, 4 decades. It sees an opportunity to finish that fight.
Interesting. So, it's so because, 1, obviously, the US and Israel are very big allies, and the US funds and provides a lot of the, military equipment that Israel uses in its wars, right? And it was known I mean, the US obviously knew that Israel was gonna launch this attack because the US was preparing by having a lot of diplomats and citizens get out of the area, right? But the US was still having these talks. Do you think the US talks are kind of just like a facade and that the US is actually okay with Israel basically trying to get a regime change and eliminate Iran's power?
It's difficult to say because President Trump has shown himself in his first term that he doesn't like wars. Yes,
Which
he
is
he is blink.
so funny to me
He's
because the man just, like, literally tries to start a war every other sentence.
That's right. But when he came in the first term, came close to war with Iran every time he decided against it. Right? He kept saying that I want a diplomatic solution to this. And then when he went to the Gulf and he saw trillions of dollars of economic opportunity, the message was very clear that a war can ruin all of that. The war is not neat and clean. Once you start in a war, you don't know how it finishes. And the third issue is that the strongest anti-war element in the United States is his own MAGA base. People like Marjorie Taylor Greene, is Tucker Carlson. It's for their own reasons, even within his own camp. His DNI chief uh,
Tulsi Gabbard.
or his vice president. These are people who have no love for Iran, but they generally don't believe in war. They don't believe it's good for the U.S. And so it's very difficult to see, who is he listening to and how is he calculating this, because it's a very crafty calculator. Now, when the Israeli attack came, I think that's very interesting. The Iranians tried to figure out, was he lying all along? In other words, he never really wanted a nuclear deal. They didn't really negotiate. I mean, he would send Steve Witkoff for half a day to Muscat or Rome. There was no sustained negotiations. The U.S. was not really prepared for the negotiations until literally the third or fourth round. So whether this was always a facade to provide time for Israel to attack. So that's one theory. The second theory was maybe it was not like the way Trump said it, that if diplomacy fails, we go to war, that he tried to use this Israeli attack as a stage in the negotiations. So the Iranians are going to be tough negotiators. maybe I would let Israelis, crush their nuclear facilities, kill some of their leaders, and then the Iranians would basically be a lot more flexible at the table. They would beg for a deal, right? And he's also saying some of those things like, when you're ready to talk, call me, kind of.
Nothing more official than a truth social truther, whatever they're called, a truth
Exactly.
tweet. Who knows what they're
Exactly.
called?
So he's making those kinds of signals. And the third is that the Iranians were also trying to think that, whether the ultimate word here is with Israel. That doesn't matter what the US says. This is no different. It's Israel that decided when the talks had failed and when they were going to do that. But the Iranians were caught off guard because one of the reasons their leaders were not in hiding, the military leaders, is because they thought they were supposed to meet in in Oman 2 days later, and that the talks were still ongoing. But so nobody knows. I mean, I think the key issue is, you have to figure out is whether he's using Bibi Netanyahu and Israel for his purposes, or is Israel using him for his purposes. So the big issue will become that Israel at some point is not able to reach its um, military aims of destroying Iran's nuclear program without the US coming in. So we will only know if he actually does enter the war.
Generally, what I would probably assuming is that Bibi thinks that he's using Trump and Trump thinks that he's using Bibi. So, because feels like those two types of men do that. Israel claimed that Iran um, was building a nuclear weapon and it was getting close and they were about to do it. And I believe that the International Atomic Energy Agency, like a couple of days ago, said that Iran had was violating their terms of agreement and were doing more enrichment and uranium enrichment than they were letting on. But a lot of other experts say that they were actually not close to building a nuclear weapon. They were developing more like 60% uranium enrichment, but like they weren't actually taking the steps to build it into a nuclear weapon. What are your thoughts? What do you know about that? Can you provide any clarity?
Well, as much as listening to, first of all, US intelligence, including the one that Tulsi Gabbard provided the Senate, and also listening to a lot of other experts, etc., that first of all, Iran has not made the political decision to build the bomb. I mean, that's the most important thing. I think until now, Iran has saw its nuclear program as a bargaining chip with the US. What does Iran want? Iran wants the US to lift these bats, hard, harsh sanctions on it, to give it breathing room that helps it stabilize the country, feed the country, invest in infrastructure. Iranians understand the US will not come to the table over any issue other than the nuclear issue, right? Not on the Hezbollah, not out of the kindness of their heart. No issue brings the Americans to the table to negotiate lifting sanctions other than the nuclear issue. So for them, I think until now, the nuclear issue was a pathway to basically loosen the chokehold that the US has around their economy, and is causing a lot of problems for them. So the political decision had not been made that we need to build a bomb, right? The decision was that we need to enrich in our own territory, because we can't trust you will provide us with nuclear fuel. We want a nuclear industry. We have needs for it. Secondly, you're correct that Iran has amassed a lot of highly enriched uranium. Uh, Israel claims enough for 9 nuclear weapons. But going from there to actually building a weapon, just having enough enriched uranium for a bomb is not the same thing as having a bomb. That takes a process of doing it. You have to test it. You have to make sure it works. You've got it right. And then you also have to then be able to create a delivery system, right? They don't have an air force inside, so it has to be fitted on missiles. That's another. It's not doable, but they're nowhere close to that. The other problem is that Prime Minister Netanyahu has been saying Iran is 6 months away, a year away from a bomb for the past 20 years. So it's essentially a very effective political talking point, right? But where I become suspicious is that that's the pathway that got us into Iraq war. Saddam is about to build a nuclear weapon. Is about to do this. And then we went to Iraq and spent the first 6 months basically digging all around the country, and we couldn't find a nuclear bomb making facility anywhere, right? So it was an argument to get us into war, which was not real. And there's a danger of that, Iran. Yes, Iran does have a nuclear program. Yes, it is very advanced. Yes, they have a lot of enriched uranium, but they're not close to bomb making yet. And they haven't made the political decision to do so. And between June 11th, when Israel launched its attack, and June 13th, which they were supposed to meet in Muscat, things weren't going to change between those 2 days as to whether Iran would have a bomb or not. So I think what Israel really aimed at was not so much to disrupt Iran's bomb making capability, but to disrupt the nuclear negotiations, right? Because, as I said, Israel was not interested in a nuclear deal that would limit Iran's program or give Iran economic relief. It wants a decisive end game with Iran, and for that, they believe it has to come through military means.
It's so interesting though, because like, why would Israel bite the hand that feeds them? The US hand.
You could look at it the other way very dispassionately. Israel has the ability to maneuver the most powerful superpower to serve its national interests. Now, Israel, like any other sovereign country, decides what its national interest is. And Israel has made a decision that its national interest lies not in a nuclear deal between US and Iran, but in Iran basically being downsized and defagged by military means. So, except Israel has the ability to maneuver the US to its position. So it doesn't see it as biting the hand, it sees actually maneuvering the hand.
What do you make of the reporting that Israel could have killed Ayatollah Khamenei, but the US said, "No, don't do it." And
I
Israel
don't I
yeah.
don't know if that's true
Really?
because we don't have independent verification, and
Mm,
Israel actually has denied it. It said
mm.
there was no such veto and all options are on the table. Israel may have decided for its own reasons that it's not a good idea because the kind of response Iran might have given to Israel might have been something that Israel was didn't want to contemplate, or the US didn't want to contemplate. What this news right now does is to allow President Trump to portray himself as the good cop with the Iranians and to provide political space for Iran to try to use the US as an off ramp to this war. So if Iran wants to come back to the US, Trump wants to say, well, there is space between me and Israel. Like when Israel wanted to keep your leader, I said no. So basically, that means that you should not put me in the same account. I'm different, and that's a clever strategy because end of the day, the United States remains the only country that can basically provide either Israel or Iran or both of them an off ramp if they choose to use one.
So interesting. And there are reports that Iran has been sending out, like,
Right.
bat signals saying, "We want this to not escalate further."
Right. And then if the bad signals come to okay, we actually want to negotiate, they have to have the political cover to say we're not negotiating with the quote unquote aggressor, the one who attacked our country. Okay, we're negotiating with a country that supported them, but not all the way. Right? It supported them on some things, but it didn't support them on a very important thing, which was the killing of the supreme leader. So as I said, it's a clever way of creating political space.
Interesting. Hmm. So, do you I mean, I'm trying to read between the lines about what you could be suggesting, but is there a potential theory that the US created that rumor and made it seem real
Well, President Trump is not unknown
for doing that?
for doing that sort of thing. I mean,
It's
I mean,
possible.
a while back he said something very provocative for all Iranians, regardless of whether they're pro-regime or anti-regime, which is we should call the Persian Gulf the Arabian Gulf,
Hmm.
like what he's doing with Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah.
And I don't know, somewhere along the line, they told him it's not a good idea. So when he went to the Gulf, he told meeting in the Gulf that if it was not for me, the Iranians would not only be calling this Persian Gulf, they would be calling it the Gulf of Iran. I mean, this has never been on the table. So he was taking
Right.
credit for something that hasn't happened. But meanwhile, it gave himself room to back down from, calling it Arabian Gulf. Uh,
Interesting.
so he's very good at that. I mean, at one level, it makes him more difficult for people to trust him, like Iranians, others to trust them.
Right.
But at the same time, he's very good at creating political space where one did not exist.
Interesting. Very interesting theory. Thank you for expanding on it. So I guess let's kind of break down what the talks were between the US and Iran. What is each side wanting? Are they going to go anywhere? Because obviously, Trump removed the US from the Obama era deal with Iran, saying it was a bad deal for the US and that Iran was going to still keep like working towards a nuclear weapon, which up for debate. But where were things at now? And how would this agreement be different from what the US had entered during the Obama era?
Well, I mean, every nuclear deal will look like every other nuclear deal, other than for the terms of it. It's just like a trade deal, like any deal. So the terms would be different. So one term Trump was insisting is that you have to give up the right, completely give up the right to enrich. And the Iranians said we see this as a fundamental right. And we're willing to give on a lot of other things, transparency, etc. But we want to be able to enrich a minimum amount for research and for medical purposes, domestic purposes at 3.5 to 5%. And we don't trust anybody would supply us if we gave that up. They didn't really negotiate under Trump. I mean, Trump came out of the Obama deal because it was the Obama deal. And because there was a lot of opposition then among Republicans, Israel, UAE, Saudi Arabia, they all thought it was a bad deal. And so he came out of it, but he wanted to sign a better deal. Like that's why he put more pressure on Iran to come to the table. The Iranians didn't come. What the Iranians did was to enrich a lot more. Iran's nuclear program became much more advanced, much bigger, much more threatening. This is when he comes back in and he says, well, you can't have a bomb. The Iranians say, that's fine. We don't want to have a bomb. So if that's your threshold, we can meet it and we can sit down and negotiate. But then, it vacillated. It went from you can't have a bomb to you can't have enrichment. There has to be zero enrichment. Then he said you can't have a bomb. So he vacillated. And then, he gave Iran a 2-month deadline that we need to have a deal within 2 months. And he then appointed Steve Witkoff as his emissary. But ironically, it looked like either the US didn't know how to negotiate or wasn't serious because they went to the first meeting completely unprepared for discussing anything of substance. They went to a second meeting and they still were not ready to discuss anything of substance because Witkoff didn't even have a proper team in place that would be able to discuss substance. And then it's only by the third meeting, then they begin to talk about substance, but they get stuck on the basic issue of should you have a right to enrich or not, right? Which is not really the substance of the negotiations because you have to negotiate over a lot of things. The 2015 deal that the US ended up leaving, Obama signed, was 156 pages long. You want to buy a house, it's, 10 pages of documents you have to sign.
I mean, I'm Gen Z, so I'll never understand what it's like to buy a house, but
Yeah,
it's a lot of
but
documents.
exactly. Our privacy pages on Instagram are
Right,
longer
right.
than that, except we don't read it. We just sign it at the end.
Exactly. What could go wrong?
But you would say that, okay, yes, right to enrich was one item. What Iran does with this enriched uranium right now is another item. What level of inspection would Iran agree to is another item. What kind of research Iran is allowed to do is another item. I mean, wasn't just this one item, but they never actually sat down in a sustained negotiation. It was at the level of, well, if you have to agree to zero enrichment at the end before we start talking. And the Iranians said, well, we can't agree to that, but here are other formulas or the way we can do it, right? So they never actually really got going. And that's where the Iranians basically misread the room, that they thought that, they're doing good faith engagement with the US around a potential path forward. but the US is essentially either not yet there or is not serious. And then the attack came, right? And that caught them off guard because they thought the diplomatic process was still ongoing.
Interesting. I've also read that they're still very open to negotiations as long as the US does not physically engage in this war as well. Because from what I've read, in order to actually hit the nuclear facilities the way that Israel wants them damaged, they would have to use US
Yeah.
bombs.
In other words, Israel does not have B-2 bombers. So literally the US has to do it. But you see, this is where political space matters. The Iranian leadership may know that President Trump gave the green light, may have encouraged Bibi to do this. All of these things they know. But the way they can always position this to their own population and to the outside world to say, well, Israel did this to disrupt the talks. US did not attack us, right? And the US is still willing to talk. So it's possible to go back to the US because US is not the one that attacked Iran, right? And so long as the US is not in the war, there is a diplomatic path, right? But the US now has to first find a way to stop the fighting, which is not easy, before it can actually start talking about the nuclear issue again.
Right. And Trump has opened the door for the US engaging in this war as well. Where do you think how do you think this is gonna off ramp?
Well, it's definitely not going to be a good off ramp if the US gets involved, because we've seen this movie before. You can definitely devastate a country from the air, but there's a point at which you have to put boots on the ground. In fact, we don't need to think about Iraq. We have to just think about a month ago with the Houthis in Yemen. It was all over New York Times that they started a campaign. His neocon national security advisor Mike Waltz, and all that signal gate was about that. Let's start bombing Yemen, and they claim that they're devastating the Houthis, etc. But then we learned that the Houthis kept shooting. They almost hit F-16s a number of times. They almost downed an F-35. They basically continued to hit American ships. It was costing the United States $1 billion a month, and it wasn't going anywhere. So Trump basically pulled the plug before an American gets killed, and you have to put boots on the ground. So yes, you can bomb Iran, but what if the regime doesn't fall? What if they don't give in? What if it's a repeat of what happened with Houthis? And then what is Trump really thinking about? Another $2 trillion war with tons of American troops put on the ground to fight in a country which is multiple the size of Iraq in terms of size, geography, mountains, etc. So I don't think deep down he wants to go to war. And maybe the Iranians understand that there is the off ramp is that the US doesn't want war, Iran doesn't want war. Things have gone off the rail. Now it's up to Trump to figure out a way to bring it back, to bring a ceasefire here, and then see how he can address Israel's concern, Iran's concern, and negotiate a deal going forward.
Right. And I think the New York Times was reporting that Israel has said that they have 2 weeks of planned attack. And I think that's the amount that's been planned. And it's going to unsure as to what's going to happen after and whether or not it's going to keep continuing.
Well, I mean, 2 weeks is a long time in this war.
Yeah, no, that's a lot of damage. But
But you're right. You're right. The war, according to The Economist, is costing Israel $300 million a day. Right?
it's just such a bad use of money.
No, it's a bad use of money. But as spectacular as Israel's economy is, etc., they're already still in the Gaza war that is also taking its own toll. And it is a heavy cost. You see, every time Iran sends a $100,000 missile towards Israel, Israel has to spend several $1 million in anti-aircraft Iron Dome missiles to bring it down. And nor that Iran can afford a long war either. So the off-ramp may be that by 2 weeks' time, both sides realize that they're not going to knock out the other side. There's not an easy victory here. And the costs, both in terms of what they're hitting, how much it's costing economically, what it means for the countries, begins to sort of change their calculations. And in fact, Trump said something to this effect, I think yesterday or something, that you just sometimes you need to let them fight it out. they're not ready to come to the table, but in 2 weeks' time, 3 weeks' time, they may be. And then they're willing to accept maybe negotiating positions, etc., that they're not willing to do right now. Both of them.
Yeah, it's like only how much money is gonna have to be spent and how many lives are gonna have to be
That's right.
lost, you know?
That's right.
So frustrating. I'm
Yeah.
so tired of egotistical men with a lot of money and a lot of weapons.
Sometimes they don't have a lot of money. Yes, I think it's actually tragic for the United States to be reliving the same nightmare again. I mean, we did it in Iraq, we did it in Afghanistan. There's a sort of a whole generation that on the left and the right basically forswore doing it again, and here we are one more time on the edge of repeating the same mistake.
Well, knock on I don't have any wood around me, but knock on wood, we don't. So,
I hope
but,
so.
Bali, any last comments, anything else you wanna discuss?
No, I mean, there's a part of this also which is important to talk, which is a lot of conversation about how quickly this regime might now fall because it faced a women's movement uprising a few years ago, etc. I mean, first of all, there is a scenario in which you would say that the way Israel is trying to eliminate the leadership in Iran, etc., or hit infrastructure, at some point the Iranian state could lose its coherence, ability to govern, etc. But that's not going to produce a democracy movement because there is not one ready to take over. So if Iran falls into chaos, begins to look like a giant Syria or a giant Libya, it's not going to be good for anybody. And ultimately, that problem would land on US's lap. And secondly, the Iranians are very angry about their government. They don't like their government. But that does not mean that they're not patriotic or that they don't see this war as a danger to themselves. I mean, when you're pinpricking nuclear sites or killing a few commanders, it's very easy to say, hooray, you're getting rid of bad guys. But when the war begins to hit refineries, electrical grid, radio and television, residential areas, et cetera, just like it's happening in Israel, the civilians begin to pay the cost. I think the way they begin to think about the war and the costs of it, whether they begins to change. And I don't think the Iranians, if you gave them a solution that, this regime can disappear and tomorrow morning you're going to have an open, democratic, wonderful regime, they would all opt for it. But if they see that the choice is between what they have and Libya or Syria, I don't think they will choose for that. And so we shouldn't market this what was heinous war as if the Iranian people are asking for it and would support it.
Right, and, I mean, we all know what happened last time the US meddled within the Iranian, leadership. So
That's there too. Exactly.
right. Alright. Well, Vali, thank you so much for providing clarity on this very complex situation. It's been very helpful.
Thanks for inviting me. It's really great to have this conversation with you.
Of course. Well, I'm your host, Emily Gross. We'll be back next week with another episode of Bureaucracy.